video, I'm going to cover vectors, what they are, and why they are useful within paper map creation. So I'm going to open up Photoshop again here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about vectors in general. Now keep in mind that vector and vector work is not only done in Photoshop. In fact, Illustrator, which is Adobe's other program, is actually known for and specifically builds vectors. And so a lot of people will use that too. If you happen to know Illustrator, great, go ahead and use it. However, it is not commonly used in the industry as much as Photoshop is. So that's why I'm teaching you how to do this within Photoshop as opposed to doing it within, say, like I said, Illustrator. Now, vectors themselves, what are they? Well, I'm going to go over here and actually create a vector circle. So we'll come over here and I'll create a little vector circle. And whatever color this circle is actually is the color of my foreground, which at this point right now is black. I'm going to duplicate this layer so we have two vector circles. Okay, side by side, and I'm actually going to turn this vector circle into a more pixel-based image by right-clicking on the layer and rasterizing it. So now this is actually a pixel-based image, while this one is still a vector, and you can see the difference here even within the thumbnails. Now, what's going on if I actually scale up, and I'm going to, hold on, let me enter this, and I'm going to grab both of these at the same time and scale them up. So we'll scale them both up, and you kind of see real quick, right, already, what's going on behind the pixel-based image and the vector image. So everything we see, technically even the vector stuff, because it has to be rendered this way, is being done with pixels because dots on the screen is what makes our image. So normal images are all based on different colored dots. If you scale them up, you get this problem, right? We start getting pixelated or blurry. However, vectors, when they're scaled up, they look great. They keep their form perfectly because really all they are is just math in the background, right? So we just add a multiplier to it. It's larger. Everything is great. So that's why you see in graphic design quite often you create images using vector, because it doesn't really matter, you know, what the size of the object is. It could be a normal paper to a billboard. If you scale it up, it doesn't matter using vector. However, obviously with pixels, it will look bad when it's scaled up. So that's why we want to use vector. And of course, vector is also nice too, not only because we can scale it up and it really doesn't matter what our initial image size is. We can always change that later, right? But because some of the tools are pretty fun to work with and easy to work with too. So let's cover some of this and how this works. So let's look at the 4 tools within Photoshop that are vector. And this is your pen tool. You have your horizontal, in this case we're going to do horizontal text tool, but you have your text tool. You also have your selection tools, and you have your shape tool. So these 4 tools are vector within Photoshop, and I'll cover each one as the video goes on. So the first one is the pen tool. So I'm going to click the pen tool, and the first thing you want to remember about the pen tool is when you click it, always make sure at the top it's set to what you want. In most cases it's going to be shape. I'll show you why you want to use path in some situations, but shape is really what you want in most cases. Now if you click and hold the mouse down on any of these tools, if it has a little tick next to it, you'll see that there are multiple tools within it. So we'll talk more about some of these later. Freeform I won't talk about because I find it fairly useless, but we'll talk about some of these. So with our pen tool, if I click on the screen, I can make a dot. If I click again, I can make 2 dots with a line between them, and 3 times, of course, which is enough to actually make a shape. Now finally I get it filled in with a color, and this color is based off of whatever color is being shown here in your foreground. So this is black. It can be changed after the fact, so don't worry about it. But yes, I can click again and keep adding points and so on. But if I click and hold my mouse down, I can actually create a curve shape by pulling out these little kind of handlebars, right? And we can click again and so on and so forth until we get to the end, and we can close it. So we go close it off on that last tool. So now we have this enclosed shape. Now what do we do with this shape, or what is the point of this? Now with this particular shape, yeah, I wasn't trying to make anything. I was just showing you, but I'll show you how you can manipulate the shape after the fact. So as I said before, you can change the color. So if you double click on the thumbnail over here, with the layer, you can change the color. We can go and move the slider and pick any color we want, but let's just do red. Right, so obviously in real time it can be constantly changed. The other great thing about it is when the layer is still selected and you can actually see your points, I don't even need to go in here and pick these tools because all those tools can be selected using hotkeys. So right now it's not selected because you don't see the points. So if I come over here and choose the path selection tool and actually click on it, I now see the points. Once those points are visible, I can come back to the pen tool, and now we can use all of those hotkeys without actually grabbing the other tool. So I can delete points by hovering over them. You see how there's a little minus next to it. I hover over the point, I can delete it without actually turning to the delete anchor point. I can also add anchor points if I want by clicking on any point that isn't an anchor, and you see a little plus, and now there's a point added there. I can also manipulate those points using the convert point tool by holding down Control or Alt, I should say, and clicking on any of these points and holding, and now I can actually convert them. If they were, say, at one point curved, I can turn them into a hard edge by holding down Alt and clicking on that point, or doing it again if it's a hard point. I can click on it and pull out the anchor points, right, and they're kind of overlapping, so we'll switch it over here, and now I can manipulate, right, these anchor points and create any kind of shape that I want, right, using that. So if I come over here, and let's just change it to the convert point tool, right, so that we don't make a mistake and start making new points or whatever. But if I click on the object with the convert anchor tool, I can now go ahead and move any of these handlebars and make any kind of shape I want, right? So some sort of like maybe 3D looking flag kind of thing going on here, right? Or whatever. So it's kind of up to you how you want to create things or whatever. This particular shape doesn't have any real point to it, but you can kind of see how you can manipulate things and create any kind of shape you want kind of out of this. Now it's kind of almost like an elephant head. It's like looking at clouds. But anyways, so as I said before, that's kind of how you can create and manipulate your shape. But the cool thing is I can go in and even manipulate it further, not just using these tools, but by adding or subtracting things from it as we talk about shapes down here. And I'll talk more about stroking paths with the brush a little bit later, but right now I want to talk about the shapes and kind of how you can combine and add to anything you've created. So the thing is, this is, if I want to create a very specific shape, I can do that using the pen tool. However, using the shape tool, I can create things like squares, obviously circles. You can see here all the different tools, your rectangles, your rounded rectangles, so kind of have rounded edges instead of corners, your ellipse tool, your polygon tool, which is any amount of sides you want. You can do a triangle, you can do 100 sides if you want. Even though at that point, though, you might as well be using the circle tool. The line tool, which I find useless, you can just make a rectangle line or whatever. And then your custom shape tool, which is the real bread and butter of everything we need to know about vectors is, and we'll talk about that just a little bit later. So first things first, I'm going to leave this on the ellipse tool. But let's just say I wanted to add kind of a circle to it, like a circle coming out of it or something to some point. Right? If you click up here, you can actually do new layer. So every time I click and make something, you'll actually notice that if I click and make a new circle, it's actually created a new layer and made that. But if I want to add to something, say maybe I'll even add to the ellipse I just made, I want to set this to combine. And now if I create another object, it's combined to the other one. So we'll see right here that these two objects are now one. If I grab them as a layer, they move together as a layer. If I say I want to subtract a shape out of it, so maybe I'll go in and I'll go the rectangle tool, right? And we'll cut a rectangle out of this, okay? So if we select, let's just say maybe I'll select the red one here, and we'll cut a rectangle shape out of it. We can come over here, go to subtract instead, and I can come over here and create this, and you'll see it actually cuts out that shape or whatever shape we're using, right? So it can literally be anything. So not just the square, but anything can be cut or added to these shapes. And any of the stuff can be manipulated just the same after the fact. So as I said before, if you select your object, we come over here and we select our entire object, we go in with, and we can manipulate these. So I can actually grab a point using these tools right here. So here's your path selection tool and your direct selection tool. Let's talk about the differences between these two, or why we want to use these tools. The path selection will grab an entire path. So this is considered an entire path. And you can see I can even move it real time, and it updates in real time the subtraction of this other object. I can also grab this entire object and move this independently, and so on and so forth. But what if I want to move just one point or maybe a couple of points? Well, that's where the other tool comes in, this white arrow, the direct selection tool. I can click on that. I can click in here and grab a couple of points at once, or even one, and I can now manipulate just this point, right? And now it's basically saying, hey, do you want to change it from being a square to something else? I can just hit yes, whatever, and now we can move this around, and it can be anything we want. So we can change that point. We can even go to our convert point tool, right, and turn this into a round section, and so on. So you're not limited to anything, really. It's great because we can use these tools to make any absolute shape we want possible. And then, like I said, you can make a box selection and grab multiple. So let's grab our layer again. But we can make a box selection, grab more than one point, and move those two together, right? So you can see I can move both of these at the same time, right, along with the other objects. Okay, So that's basically how you manipulate and how you add to or subtract from using vectors. Now there are other shapes within here, right? So we have our, like I showed you before, the rounded rectangle, which will give you kind of little rounded edges. You can control that roundness, right, by coming over here and changing the radius. So if I was to say instead of being 10, I do 50, you'll see that now I have a much more like, rounded surface than this one, as we can see there. You can also, and remember, any of these, if you hold shift, you can create a perfect shape out of it. So we can create a perfect square out of something by holding shift or whatever, a perfect circle with the ellipse. The polygon tool right here, just say how many sides you want. The default's 5, so you can create a pentagon. But if you want to create anything like 3, that's obviously the smallest you can go. You can create a triangle and so on. So we can create all sorts of shapes doing that. And remember, you can always click over here and change the color of them. The other cool thing too is about these shapes is that you can merge shapes together, right? So instead of having all these layers, we talked about layers before and you got all the stuff going on, let's just say, a couple of these things are the same layer, right? So maybe I'm going to shut off some of these layers here so we don't get so confused with all the stuff going on. But let's just say we have this triangle here and we want the triangle to be a part of the square layer at the same time. So these two. So I'm going to hold control, select both of those. If you right click and then go merge shapes, you can actually turn them into one layer. Now of course, the way vectors work, they will, if one is one color, they'll both turn to the same color. But now we'll actually see that these two have been merged, but they're still vectors, right? I didn't right click and rasterize them or flatten them or merge visible or any of that stuff. What I'm trying to do is just merge the shape. So if you use the merge shape tool, it'll keep them vectors and we can go on and do more stuff with them, right? So let's take a look at actually the most useful of all of them, which is the custom shapes. And we'll come over here and switch that to this bottom one here to custom shapes. And the great thing about custom shapes is there are some that come with Photoshop, but there are tons of them free online, or you can even make your own, right? So let's just talk a little bit about that. So right here you see that the default is some arrow, right? We can choose all these different things. Like arrows are fairly useful, right, in a paper map. So we can click on this, click on an arrow shape, right, and draw out an arrow. Now you can draw it free form, right? So it can be any shape. It can be really thin if you want, but if you hold shift, it will keep its proportions the way that it's drawn initially, and then bam, you got yourself an arrow, right? So we can move it around. We can hit Control T to rotate it, right, or whatever. And this can be obviously very useful within your paper maps. Now there are other shapes, of course, right? So we can come in here and you can see they have hearts and other things like that. Photoshop even has some that are already default. If you click on this little gear, you can do things like, what if we want more arrows, or let's just do animals, right? We click on animals, we can hit append. So just like brushes, you can either replace them or append or add to them. If I hit add, now you'll see that we have some animal shapes. Now it's not infinite, but some of these, like say you actually have a dog in the game and you want to represent it with an icon. Boom, here's a dog, right? We can do that. If you don't want the shape to be as complex, you can come in here and actually just, maybe do a paw, because that makes just as much sense, right? And so we can keep it simple when we're actually thinking about what we want to add, right? But we can also add even more custom stuff. So this is just the stuff Photoshop has, but let's just say you downloaded something off the internet. Now I supply you guys, right, with a bunch that I found in basically one night. I just went around, found a bunch of free stuff, and actually come over here, I have the paper map shapes. I even added them to their own thing. So I have like arrows or buttons or enemies, things like that, human, lock and keys, medical, stuff like that, and random, like if I couldn't think of a place to put them in. But you can see I got a whole ton of these, right? And the way you load up these, and I actually, I'll take some of these and I'll put these on the desktop, so it makes it a little bit easier for me to load them up. But let me go down here, grab, let's just say, let's do enemies, right? So we'll copy that and I'll paste that onto the desktop, right? So once it's been pasted to the desktop over here, I can come back to Photoshop, okay? We can go over here and I can click on this and we can do load shapes. So now I can load any shapes, right? And these are CSH files. So any CSS files you can find on the internet, or someone's made some shapes for you, you can use them. Remember, you're not actually publishing these, so it's not like you make money off them. So theoretically, you can use copyrighted stuff. It's not a big deal. But what we're gonna do is I'm gonna find that on the desktop. So we'll click here, desktop. There's the enemy shapes. I can hit load. And now if I come down here, you'll see all of these shapes that I added to the enemy. So if you want a simple alien head for maybe a bad guy or something like that. But any of the stuff can be grabbed, and the awesome thing about it is it could be manipulated after the fact. So maybe here's a hazard sign that would look great, right? So we can click on the hazard sign. Maybe I switch it to yellow, right? Because yellow makes a little sense for that. We draw out our hazard, hold down shift to make the shape, and then say I'll double click on this. We can even add any of these layer styles that I talked about before, like, maybe to make it pop a little bit, I'll do a stroke. So we'll click on stroke, we'll make the stroke a little bit larger, right? And there you go. And now this kind of really pops out. And as I said before, the cool thing is even these can be manipulated. So if I change into this convert point tool, I can manipulate the shape to be anything I want. Now, of course, once I have that shape in the scene, I can use it for other things. And so when you're building your paper map, every time you bring in a new shape that's going to represent something, you duplicate it, right? So if I have the object selected, right, the layer selected, I hold down Alt and I move, I make a copy of that layer. So I can move this off to the side so that later when I do my key or legend, right, I can stick it over here to the side. Okay, and then you can keep duplicating these and add them everywhere you want. So as long as you're holding down Alt and moving, every time you move and let go of the mouse, you can duplicate again and again and again. So you can create a lot of content doing that. So that's one of the awesome things about these custom shapes and how this stuff works. But let's just say you even want to make your own custom shape. So this crazy little shape that I made over here, if I can go find that again, amongst all this nonsense. So here this is, I can actually make this a custom shape and save that. So as long as I have the layer selected, the object itself selected, right? So I'm just going to double make sure that everything's selected by grabbing the paths here. But all that's selected. If I go up to edit, you should see this define custom shape. I click on this and there's that crazy custom shape. I may call whatever I want. Maybe I'll just call it blob, right? And hit OK. And now that shape is saved. So if I go to my custom shape tool, click right here, you'll see all in the bottom, there's my little blob. So I can grab this and draw it out any shape, right? I can hold shift and keep its proportions to whatever the original object was and keep duplicating it and making it. So you can see where, if you made a couple of paper maps, now suddenly with all these objects and all the stuff that you have, right, you can quickly make more paper maps because you have all of these things saved from the previous times you've done it, and you'll just be faster and better as you do that. Now the text tools, the next kind of big thing I want to talk about, because obviously we can put lots of different shapes, and I can hide this stuff so we don't have all of these things on the screen here, right? But the text tool is great too because obviously you can do text, right? So you click, hold your mouse down, make out a box, whatever is in here, you start typing. So I can decide, type in hello, right? And this text, because this image is so big, it's really tiny. So I'm actually going to hit Control A to select all of the text. And you can come up here and change the font size. So if I say 200 now, right? There you go. Now you can see the font. Right, you can even do it like in paragraph format. We can center it, whatever, yada, yada, yada. You can even do effects to your text, like I can curve it. So I can set this to like an arc and curve it and do all this other crazy stuff. The cool thing is this is vector, so this will get manipulated any way I want. I can change these settings. You can play with the stuff if you want. Most of this stuff is not useful necessarily for a paper map. It's just nice in Photoshop. But obviously in a paper map, you do want to have some text. You can choose a font. If you want to do a different font, we can click here and choose a different font, and it will change, so we can do that. And there's our different font, right? You can change the color, right, by double clicking in here and coming up to the top where the color is, and we can change the color to anything too, right? So you can change that. You can also add, just like any other shape, you can add, layer styles, like we can put a drop shadow on this, right, and make it look cool, and so on and so forth, right? So all of this stuff can be done and added and manipulated, right, also to your paper map. Now, there are a couple other things I wanted to talk about real quick. And in some cases, I talked about like different terrain, right? Like we have the terrain that can be, swamp, or it can be something else. Now there's another thing that's really cool within Photoshop, and this works with literally any of your shapes, right? So whether it be, right, text or whether it be an object, and I'll just do this object because it's a little easier to see. But you can also add, if you double click on anything here, patterns, right? So we have our pattern overlay. So a pattern overlay, if I turn that on, right, here's our pattern, it instantly puts a pattern on this. So if I wanted something to look like this, right, it's still a vector. It's still using the vector shape, but it's covering the vector with this pattern, and I can actually move the scale of the pattern so I can do it more. So if I want to have some cross hatching, right, I can do that with cross hatching. I can pick different, there's different ones that are default within Photoshop, but you can make literally any image, right, into a pattern if you wanted to. So, and the great thing about that is if I can just come over here, I'm just going to hit OK and keep this, but if I go up to the top here, and I go to edit, just like before where I had the define custom shape, you can define a pattern. So you can make an image, right? So you can make something that looks like that little swamp symbol or something else like that. Just click on define pattern, right? In this case, it's taking my entire image and making it a pattern, right? So the thing that says hello and this, if I call it whatever I want, I can just leave it, this is the name of the actual file, but if I hit OK, right now I can come in, double click on this again and add on the pattern overlay. We can click on the down arrow and there's that new pattern I made, and that can be a pattern. It's kind of like Inception here. But this thing, because it's scaled up, I can actually scale it down so we can see it. The other cool thing about the pattern is you can move it. So if I come over here, I can actually move it within the scene. You can see I have the hello in there or whatever, but it'll repeat over and over again. You can make it repeat a ton, right? So we can see it over and over again as a pattern. So that's really cool also. It can help you create some of your paper map things if you're trying to create a style or something like that with it. And then of course you can also, just like any of these, so let me maybe turn on this other object here, so this pentagon shape, you can and move this over here, you can use any of these layer styles, right? And so maybe I do like, not a bevel and emboss, but I was going to do a stroke here, right? So we do a stroke, and we talked about before with your opacity and fill, maybe I just want that shape, right? I just want the outside of the shape and not the whole thing. Like maybe these are the walls of the thing, and I wanted the room to be a pentagon shape. Well, I just make the thickness of the stroke the thickness of the walls, and then I just drop down the fill to 0, and now this object, right, there's your walls, right? So the inside is empty, and it could be anything that you want interior wise. So you can build walls that way too. So that works, right? And as I was saying before, right, when we talked about these shapes, you can cut things in and out of shapes, right? We can do that. We can add and take away shapes. So if I was to add to this shape, even when the layer style live, right? So let me come in here. Maybe I was adding a hallway to this pentagon shaped room. If I come over here and make sure that I'm set to combine, right, and I have my object selected here, right? So we're combine object selected. If I come over and create a new shape coming out of it, like a hallway, you'll notice, whoops, and this one actually created a new one because it wasn't on combine, so we'll do that again. But it'll create a hallway right there, and it will update in real time the stroke. So that's really awesome, right? Like I said, all this is great because you can move it and manipulate it in real time. So with a stroke around an object, right, I can come in and use our tools here, right, so we can manipulate the actual object. So let me click back on it here, and we'll grab our direct select tool, and now I can grab like any of these points and I can manipulate the room size or what it looks like or whatever, right? So you can see how useful vector can be when you're using all of this stuff. Now the last thing I wanted to talk about that can be helpful in creating content was, as I mentioned before, and I'd get back to it, was with the pen tool, the path idea. So remember how I mentioned you're going to have a critical path and you want to have that path kind of move across the scene. So one of the things that a path will do outside of a shape fills in a path is just that. It's just a line. So even if I close it off, it's still just a line. But the cool thing about a path, so once I do this, I can come in here, and let's just say I'm making the path through the level. So you come up here, you go down here, you do whatever, and here's the end. So there's your critical path. Now this object doesn't show up the way, we don't actually see anything. A path is kind of separate, right? But so if I actually was to click off of the path completely in general, it would disappear. And so you have a little tab over here called paths. So you have your layers, your channels, your paths. If I click on that, there's my path right there. If I click off of it, it's gone. It's invisible. So it's not really a line. But if I say want to make a critical path out of that, let's just say I want the critical path to be red. So I'm going to come in here and choose a red color. Okay, and I'm going to choose a paintbrush. And actually, any color, any paintbrush I pick, and we got to remember, if we're going to paint a path, we do need a separate layer for it to be on. You can't paint on a hidden layer, and you can't paint on a vector layer. So we're going to make a brand new layer so that we can put this this line on. Right, so if I go back to path here, and if I was to draw on this layer, you can see there's the line. Now, maybe I don't want my line that thick, so I'm going to shrink my brush down. Because what's going to happen here is we're going to take this path and stroke it all the way across this entire path that we just made, okay? So this paintbrush, so whatever it is. So if it's a small red line, that's what's going to move across this. So with our path selected, I come down here and you'll see this little thing right here, the second one, which is called stroke path with brush. As soon as I click it, boom, it will take that brush, whatever it is, the color and the shape of the brush, and draw it across that vector line, and there I can use as my critical path, right? So you can go in and make it very nice and clean and hard-edged or you know, curvy or whatever. So anyway, excuse me. those are all the tools that you need to know in order to be successful in creating a paper map. And as I said before, you can kind of see if I switch back, actually I'm going to come over here and switch back to my examples, right? So my past student work, you can see how they used their vectors, right? And these are all vector shapes that they just came in there and just kind of duplicated them and put them in there. And this is actually a very high-res image, so I can zoom up in the image and actually see more detail, right? And that's because you can see this is all done in vector. He just copied these trees over and over again, just kept copying them, probably put them all in one object, so it's a little bit simpler. But there you go, right? This is how you can see and how you can create a paper map. You even use a little bevel up here to make that a little bit fancier and so on and so forth. So it's up to you what you want to do, how you want to do that. But these are the tools you should now be able to use and create your paper maps with. So hopefully you learned something. Thanks for watching this series, and I'll see you guys in the next one.